Happy 250th birthday, America. The bells are ringing. The fireworks are painting the sky in expensive bursts of red and blue. And the history books are being dusted off to tell you the same comfortable lie they've told for 2.5 centuries. They want you to believe in the miracle at Philadelphia. They want you to believe that in 1776, a group of powdered-wig geniuses sat in a hot room and conjured a civilization out of thin air. They call it Year Zero, a sudden divine spark of enlightenment that turned a wilderness into a republic. But miracles don't leave forensic footprints, and 1776 wasn't a birth, it was a rebranding. We are obsessed with our own youth, acting as if 250 years is an eternity. But in the scheme of human civilization, the United States is a toddler having a tantrum. You are celebrating a birth certificate that was written over a forged deed. You don't build a continental federalism in a weekend, and you don't perfect a consensus-based democracy over a single summer. You find the heart of the forest. You find a system that has already survived 1,000 years of winter. You strip it of its spirit, and you pray the original architects don't come back with the bill. This is what scholars like Bruce Johansen call the Iroquois influence thesis. But let's call it what it is: a forensic trail of intellectual theft. The truth is, the foundation of this country isn't brick and mortar, it's stolen code. We are living in a house we didn't design, governed by a law we don't understand, celebrating an anniversary that marks the moment the heist went public. The founding fathers weren't architects. They were interns who stole the master's blueprints, crossed out the parts that required a conscience, and slapped their own names on the patent. Before you light the next firework, you need to ask yourself, are you celebrating a beginning, or are you just cheering for the greatest intellectual theft in human history? The American miracle is just the vanquished reality in a cheap suit. Let's look at the actual clock. For the first 100 years after contact, the Europeans weren't conquerors, they were apprentices. They were the shivering, starving toddlers of Turtle Island. When the first ships leaked their passengers onto these shores in the early 1600s, they didn't find a lawless void. They stepped into a highly sophisticated legal and social house that had been standing for nearly a millennium. As the late Vine Deloria Jr. famously argued, the wilderness was a European fiction created to justify a takeover. The reality was a landscape governed by a law so stable, it didn't need a single jail or a standing army to maintain it. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, had a choice. They saw these ragged strangers, confused and dying, and they could have swept them back into the salt water. Instead, they practiced Skenyen, the Great Peace. They opened the door. They didn't just teach the newcomers how to plant corn. They taught them how to live in a world where your neighbor's survival is your own. This was a 100-year apprenticeship. The colonizers lived under the shadow of the Great Law, protected by its protocols of hospitality, watching a society where every person had a voice and no one went hungry. But hospitality is a concept the European mind eventually mistook for weakness. They sat at the council fires, they listened to the orators, and they began to realize that the neighbors next door had a political technology that made the British Parliament look like a playground for tyrants. They spent a century breathing the air of a true democracy, absorbing the mechanics of federalism by osmosis. They were students who eventually decided they didn't want to pay the tuition. They moved from being guests at the fire to being spies at the table, calculating exactly how much of the law they could take and how much of the people they could discard. They studied the Kayane Renkova not to join it, but to mine it for the strength they lacked. Enter the man they call the Architect of America, Benjamin Franklin. The history books paint him as a visiting scholar of the Enlightenment, but Franklin was a third-generation colonist. By the time he was born in 1706, his family had been on this land for nearly 70 years. He wasn't looking to London or Paris for the New World. He was a man of the frontier. As Bruce Johansen documents in Forgotten Founders, Franklin spent 30 years as a colonial diplomat, and a printer of Indian treaties. He didn't find democracy in a coffee shop library. He found it in the forest, listening to the orators of the Six Nations. The smoking gun is the Treaty of Lancaster in 1744. Franklin was there, recording the words of the Onondaga chief, Canasatego. The chief looked at the bickering, disorganized colonies that couldn't even agree on where their borders were, and he gave them the cheat sheet to empire. He told them, "Be like us. Our forefathers established a union that made us formidable. One arrow is easily broken, but a bundle is indestructible." Franklin didn't just hear the advice, he obsessed over it. He realized that the Haudenosaunee had the superior tech that the bickering British colonies desperately needed to survive. Franklin spent the next 40 years translating that indigenous technology into English. In his 1751 letter to James Parker, he wrote that if ignorant savages could form a union that appeared indissoluble, it would be strange if 10 or a dozen English colonies couldn't do the same. He wasn't inventing a union, he was scouting a model. He took the bundle of arrows and put it in the eagle's claws on the Great Seal. He took the Great Council and called it a Congress. He was a double agent of ideas, taking a 1,000-year-old American reality and branding it as a new European discovery to impress the elites across the Atlantic while keeping the original source hidden in the shadows of the frontier. If the 1744 treaty was the inspiration, the 1775 Albany speech is the official confession. Just as the revolution was beginning, the Continental Congress sent a formal delegation to the Haudenosaunee. They stood before the Six Nations and officially declared that they were following the ancient advice of the Indigenous forefathers. As Donald Greenday points out, the founders admitted that the American Union was the happy fruit of the seed the Haudenosaunee had planted 30 years prior. But constitutionalists will scream that they didn't need the Haudenosaunee, that they had the natural rights of Locke and Rousseau. Here is the final ghost we bust. Where did those European philosophers get their ideas? Locke and Rousseau were writing in a Europe that was a graveyard of kings and peasants. It wasn't until the first reports of indigenous societies reached Europe, reports of a world with no jails, no poor, and no kings, that the Enlightenment suddenly invented the state of nature. The founders weren't bringing liberty from Europe to the Americas. They were witnessing it here, trying to describe it with a European vocabulary, and then claiming they invented it. They didn't find natural rights in a book. The books were written to explain the Haudenosaunee reality. But as soon as the war was won, the confession was buried. Once they had the keys to the house, they didn't want anyone to remember who had built the foundation. They took that official acknowledgement and tucked it away in the archives, replacing it with the myth of American exceptionalism. They wanted you to think they were the pioneers of liberty, when in reality, they were just the beneficiaries of a legacy they were already planning to erase. They stood on the shoulders of a 1,000-year-old giant, reached for the crown, and then spent the next 2 centuries trying to pretend the giant never existed. The confession was signed in ink, but it was deleted in the retelling. The heist wasn't finished until the crime scene was cleaned. This is the Great Erasure, the deliberate scrubbing of the Haudenosaunee from the American memory. The French called them Iroquois, a corruption of a slur, meaning snakes. The Americans kept the name because you can't admit your government is based on the laws of a people you've branded as savages. Constitutionalists will try to tell you the eagle's arrows are Roman, a tribute to the fasces. But look closer. The Roman fasces is a bundle of rods tied around an axe, a symbol of the state's power to execute its own. The peacemaker's arrows were a symbol of interdependence. They swapped the story to hide the source. And while they were carving those arrows into the seal of the new republic, George Washington, the man the Haudenosaunee called Conotocaurius, the town destroyer, was busy burning the schools where those ideas were born. During the 1779 Sullivan Expedition, Washington ordered the total scorched earth destruction of Haudenosaunee villages and orchards. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was burning the library, You can't justify manifest destiny while wearing the stolen clothes of the people you're displacing. They turned a living, sophisticated civilization into a primitive footnote to make the theft look like a settlement. Even when the truth was forced into the light, they tried to kill it with silence. In 1988, the 100th Congress passed House Concurrent Resolution 331, officially acknowledging that the Confederation of the original 13 colonies was influenced by the political system of the Iroquois Confederacy. Why haven't you heard of it? Because the erasure is still active. If the public realized the Constitution is an intellectual extraction, the foundation of exceptionalism crumbles. They took the law, they deleted the authors, and they replaced the good mind with a Roman smokescreen, ensuring the teachers would be treated as enemies, while the students played at being the masters. Now we perform the autopsy. This is where the heist becomes a desecration. The founders didn't just copy the Great Law, they performed a surgical mutilation on it. They took the skeleton, the federalism, the two-house legislature, the executive veto, because they needed the structural strength to hold an empire together. Orthodox historians will scream that the 1787 Constitution is purely European, borrowed from Montesquieu and Rome, and they are half right, which makes the betrayal even worse. The founders used the Indigenous model for the 1754 Albany Plan and the Articles of Confederation just long enough to survive and win their war. But once the dust settled, the elites panicked. In 1787, they pivoted back to European frameworks to protect their property and insulate themselves from the true democracy they had just witnessed. They kept the indigenous structure of a united republic, but stuffed it with Roman oligarchic failsafes. But they murdered the heart. As Seneca scholar Barbara Mann meticulously explains, the Haudenosaunee system is fundamentally matrilineal and consensus-based. The founders took the structure, but threw away the morality that made it functional for a millennium. In the Great Law, the ultimate authority isn't a president or a judge. It's the clan mothers. They hold the titles, they monitor the leaders, and they are the only ones with the power to dehorn a chief who fails the people. The founders, products of a patriarchal Europe, couldn't stomach answering to women, so they erased them. They replaced the living, breathing justice of the clan mothers with a Supreme Court, a panel of untouchable men appointed for life, designed to protect property and privilege rather than the heartbeat of the community. They traded a system of checks and balances for a system of elite insulation. They took consensus, the good mind where every voice must be aligned, and they replaced it with majority rule. They turned a tool of harmony into a weapon of 51% against 49%, ensuring that the minority would always be under the boot of the majority. And most tragically, they deleted the seventh-generation mandate. The Great Law requires that every decision consider the faces of the children yet unborn. The founders replaced that eternal responsibility with a pursuit of happiness that was actually a pursuit of immediate profit. They took a living, spiritual covenant and turned it into a cold, commercial contract, leaving the earth and the unborn without a seat at the table. The experts like to play it safe. They'll give you the date of 1142 AD because they found a solar eclipse in a textbook. Orthodox anthropologists will demand carbon dating, dismissing anything older as myth. But Western science has a habit of discovering what indigenous oral traditions have known all along. But as Barbara Mann and the Keepers know, the Great Law is far older. It remembers the time before the ice melted. It remembers the Niaguaje, the monster bear of the megafauna. We've seen Western science be wrong by 10,000 years at the White Sands footprints in New Mexico, proving science is a lagging indicator for indigenous memory. A law as complex as the Kayanerenkowa doesn't just pop up. It is a high-level sociological technology that requires a millennium of social evolution. A law of peace only happens after a cycle of war. You don't get the Kayanerenkowa unless you've spent centuries bleeding. By 1142, they weren't just agreeing, they were healing a 1,000-year wound. Between 600 AD and 900 AD, the Northeast underwent an agricultural revolution that forced people into permanent villages. You don't get a peace treaty in 1142 unless the engine of diplomacy has been running since the crisis began in 600 AD. It takes hundreds of years to train a human mind to prefer consensus over revenge. It takes centuries to embed a law so deeply that it becomes the heart of a people. The US is a 250-year-old startup that tried to copy a 1,500-year-old legacy system. The reason the American government is paralyzed today, stuck in gridlock and ecological collapse, is because the thieves in 1787 didn't understand the engine they were stealing. They took the federalism, but left out the good mind. They took the arrows, but left out the peace. You can't run a 1,000-year law on a 100-year ego. Logic is simple. If it took the enlightened founders 150 years of staring at the model just to copy the bones, it took the Haudenosaunee a millennium to grow the soul. As we stand in 2026, the fireworks are a distraction. We are celebrating the 250th anniversary of a miracle that never happened. 250 years. In the eyes of the Haudenosaunee, that's not a civilization. That's a fever dream. The Roman Empire lasted a millennium. The Great Law has been running since 600 AD. The United States is a toddler claiming to be a sage. We are the shortest-lived superpower in history, and we are already gasping for air because we tried to build a body without a soul. We are an experiment that is failing because we ignored the lab notes of the masters. The question for this sesquicentennial isn't whether we can save the Constitution. The question is, are we brave enough to admit we were never the architects? We were just the interns who thought we knew better than the master. We took the life and the liberty from a law we never named, and we used it to build a machine for the pursuit of property. We are living in a hollowed-out version of an ancient sacred law, and the prophet who designed the original is still standing in the shadows, waiting for us to return the heart we stripped away. The heist is over. The cover-up is failing. The 600 AD engine is still running in the hearts of the vanquished, while the 1776 forgery is breaking down in the streets. We don't need a new America. We need an original truth. We need to stop cheering for the founders and start listening to the architect. Because the tree of peace was planted long before the first European ship ever touched the sand, and its roots are still deeper than any monument in DC. The theft is documented. The evidence is clear. The only question left is, are you ready to meet the man who actually gave you your freedom?